there is a solution, and it's called these. We can make the USA metal independent by picking up these nodules and processing them on USA soil. Now that would require us to build something, of course, and that would be, that's what the Act is for.
Hello to viewers tuning into Assay TV to catch this exclusive update from the Metals Company. Now, the Metals Company is a NASDAQ-listed developer firm focusing on building a vital and well-managed metal commons to enable the electrification revolution. And with me today is Gerard Barron, CEO and Chairman of the company. Gerard, welcome.
Adam, great to be here.
Yeah, thanks for taking time to speak with us and introduce the Metals Company and also update on some really key bits of news flow that we've got coming through. So exciting times for you, but why don't we start with that in terms of introducing the company. You're working on one of the largest estimated undeveloped resources of battery metals in the world, in the Clarion Clipperton Zone in the Pacific Ocean. But what does that all mean? Can you tell us about this resource in a little more detail?
Yeah, so if we take a step back, the planet is 70% covered in ocean, right? And so it makes sense that there are metals in the ocean, right? Because on land, we went to all of the obvious ones. And obviously, what we're doing now is we're having to push into the less obvious ones and the less desirable ones as well, because they're trapped under rainforests. If we think of nickel laterite, so you've got to tear down these very biodiverse carbon sinks, and just to get to the metal bearing ore and then to process it, you generate loads of waste and tailings, which further can damage the environment. So it makes sense that we should be looking at that 70% of the planet that is ocean. And like in the ocean, there are, and the same on land, there are some projects that should be developed, and there are some projects that, in our opinion, should not be developed. And look at say a Canadian nickel sulfide deposit. You would argue that that's a good project compared to a nickel laterite project in Indonesia or the Philippines. Bad project, typically. And when I say bad, I'm talking about the CO2 impacts, the tailings, the impact on biodiversity, and so on. And the same in the ocean. And what we have is a very large deposit of polymetallic nodules. And there are other types of metals in the ocean, right? There are sulfides and seafloor crusts, but they require mining. You've got to go down there and turn big rocks into little rocks. Whereas ours just sit on the ocean floor like this nodule sitting on my hand. And our job is to pick them up with the greatest efficiency and the lowest impact. Yeah, it's an exciting time. We've identified the resource. We've moved some of it from inferred to indicated and measured. We've been at this for a dozen years. We've been completing all of the resource definition work. We've been completing our environmental studies. We've been collecting baseline data for the last years, and it's all coming to a conclusion when we will lodge an application to move from the exploration phase to apply for an exploitation contract, which we expect to do in the second half of next year.
Wow, excellent. So it's all systems go, but just coming into where you're at right now with the International Seabed Authority and the current exploration license, could you fill us in with a little bit more detail there? Because it's a delicate situation working with a regulator, but equally one that you have to be the trusted partner for. So it's great news that you've got the exploration license. And how's that all going?
Yeah, look, it's so maybe a small history lesson for your listeners. This industry almost got started 50 years ago.
Wow.
And so if we cast our mind back, you have Shell, BP, Mitsubishi, Sumitomo, Lockheed Martin, all were out there collecting these very same rocks. Rio Tinto had built a processing plant. They were looking for the nickel and copper. But 50 years ago, the world had not agreed who owns the oceans. And so the United Nations stepped in and stopped them. And it was not until 1982 when UNCLOS was finally agreed. And UNCLOS stands for the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea. And that basically set up the boundaries. It said, as a sovereign, you own everything within 12 miles of your coastline. You have an economic right to everything within 200 miles, but beyond that, it's not owned by you. In fact, it's owned by everyone. It's the common heritage of humankind. Mm-hmm. And they set up this intergovernmental agency called the International Seabed Authority to regulate it. And the International Seabed Authority is made up of 168 member countries, Canada being one, China, Japan, Korea. And they are there to put in place a regulatory regime to allow the development of this industry. And so we have exploration licenses, the same way that China does and Japan does and France and Germany. And that allows us to do all of the exploration work and then to apply for an exploitation contract over that same defined area. Now, the reason why now is such an exciting time is that the missing piece in this entire jigsaw is about to drop into place, and it's called the Final Exploitation Code. It was due to be in place by the middle of 2020, but then came COVID, and so everything got delayed. And so now the ISA has committed to have that regulatory piece of the jigsaw in place by next year. And we're working to that timetable. We'll be ready to lodge once it is in place. And that's really the beginning of the industry. And you know, it's interesting because normally industries begin, if we look at the land-based mining or oil and gas, and then they get regulated. Whereas in this case, there's been so much debate before anything has happened, because there is no collection of these polymetallic nodules anywhere in the world at the moment. So we will be first, yet it's already a very highly scrutinized and regulated industry. So, and I think that's good. I think it's good that everyone is held to a very high account.
Yeah, if you think about some of the ESG challenges that mining has, not only to convince investors, but also public perception, these are resources that we need, yet there are a history of errors and issues throughout the industry. Don't need to mention them all for the land-based stuff. So yeah, I see a point around the scrutiny and the oversight helping you to come into this, you know, at a quicker pace and doing things right.
And to that point, I often say to people, look, the idea of protecting the oceans is a really easy thing to get behind. That's what we are doing. We're developing this business to protect the oceans, because the biggest risk to our oceans is global warming and acidification. Yeah, that's what the biggest risks to our oceans are. And so we need to address CO2 emissions. We need to protect biodiversity on land. We need to protect the carbon sinks. And of course, what people think of is land-based mining. And so if you think about, you know, if we were going to go and do that, but in the ocean, it'd be like, no way. There's no way in the world we would be interested. I'd be on the other side of the argument at that moment. But this is very different. You know, we're talking about the Abyssal Zone. It's an area that makes up almost half of the entire planet. It's about 4,000 meters below sea level. It's an area where there's obviously no light. Light stops at about 400 or 500 meters below sea. There's not much energy, and because there's not much food. And so if you measure the amount of biomass per square meter in this part of the Pacific Ocean, there's about 10 grams per square meter. And most of that is bacteria that lives in the sediment. So there is no flora. You don't see plants growing. And you just see this marine desert with these nodules. Now, it doesn't mean there's no life. There's bacteria living in the sediment, or in some cases on the nodules. And that's what our environmental studies are all focused on, is what is the life? What's the impact going to be of us actively collecting these rocks? Will the area recover? Because, and all of the scientific evidence that we're gathering at the moment is very encouraging, very encouraging. You know, just a small example, people think this is pristine, leave it alone, like it's never been touched. But we, as part of our environmental study, have these sediment traps, which we position out there. So it monitors what's going on, which way the currents go. Also collects any sediment that's in the water. when we collect those sediment traps, they're full of sediment, which indicates that there is a lot of, it's called the benthic zone. There's a lot of benthic activity. There's storms down there. And so that's all we're going to do, actually. We're going to create a little bit of dust, as we collect the nodules. And think of it as driving your car down a dirt road. You'll kick up some dust. The question is, how far will the dust travel? What will be the impact of it? And so that's what our environmental studies are focused on, is just that. And also, sometimes people speculate that this dust will travel for thousands of miles. It doesn't. The studies are proving that it only rises 5 to 6 meters above the seafloor. The particles tend to flocculate together. They bind together, which makes them heavier, and they settle pretty well straight away. And so what we found is that our studies and other studies, that the sediment tends to stay localized. So it doesn't travel for large distances. But you've got to spend the money and do the science to get the answers to those questions, because everything else is just speculation. It's like, what if you're wrong? What if sediment doesn't travel? And of course, that's what the many tens of millions of dollars, by the time we finished, it'll be well over $100 million that we will have spent on the environmental impact study that we're under at the moment. So yeah, it's exciting. I mean, this is real science.
Absolutely. Yeah. And scientifically backed up. And that makes sense totally. But some of the things you described, they're quite a challenging physical environment. With that in mind, and the uniqueness of the project, and the relative infancy, as you said, of the industry, how does that reflect on the project economics? It's for people interested in resources, fantastic opportunity here. But how do they make sense of the metals company, the economics behind it? How are you going to actually get to production?
Well, it's a little bit counterintuitive, but actually where it's located is one of the most amazing advantages that we have. Think about the alternative. So I was recently visiting the Platte Reef mine, and long way underground. They'd been building that shaft for 5 years, right? And they still had another couple of years to go when I visited. And so land-based projects require an enormous amount of infrastructure to be built around them. So first you've got to, provide water supply and power and roads and rail and eventually deep water ports. And sometimes some of that might be available, but more often than not, it's not. And so that can be the gating item with land-based projects, that you've got to lay down so much infrastructure. And then you've got to spend years and years ripping away the topsoil or putting down a shaft to get to the metal-bearing ore. So now look at the alternative. In our case, we have to convert our first boat, the Hidden Gem, is an ex-drill ship. And with our partner Allseas, it's been converted into the first nodule collecting vessel. So it gets converted, you float it on out there. It's in production as soon as you drop the riser and start collecting nodules. I mean, and then of course you pick up the nodules, you put them onto a transport vessel, and you ship them to shore. But you don't ship them somewhere you've got to build a port or build stuff. Our first batch of nodules in the early years will go to somewhere with a deep water port, able to handle the nodules straight away. And so that has massive impact on the capital and the economics. And, actually operating at 4,000 meters below sea level, it's a daunting prospect if you're not familiar with it. But that's why in the early days, we went to the offshore oil and gas sector to look for our partners. So we had Maersk as one of our early shareholders. Right. We had Allseas as our biggest investor. And people have never heard of Allseas probably, but it's a private company, but one of the world's largest layers of pipe for the oil and gas industry in the deep ocean. So they spent 37 years operating in these very deep, extreme environments. And so for them, it's like, we do it every day. And so you've just got to make sure that you bring in the partners who can de-risk it in a way that other people looking at it for the first time, want to go, oh my goodness, how am I going to do that? But someone else looks at it and says, piece of cake. And so, what that does is make our economics very attractive as we get started. And then comes along the geopolitical drama that we're in now. And of course, the Inflation Reduction Act comes along. Clearly that's a tremendous boost for us, because if you analyze what that Inflation Reduction Act really means for the natural resources industry in USA, it means that if you're buying nickel that's coming out of Indonesia, you're not going to be able to get access to that typically. If you buy nickel that's coming out of Russia or China, you're not going to be able to get access to the incentives that are embedded in the Inflation Reduction Act. And of course, the legislators knew this. And some of the car companies and the battery companies are starting to complain. But there is a solution, and it's called these. We can make the USA metal independent by picking up these nodules and processing them on USA soil. Now, that would require us to build something, of course. And, that would be, that's what the act is for. It's to put incentives there. The Department of Energy also have funds that encourage the construction of these projects. And if we go back to the 100-day Biden review on critical minerals, the number one strategic priority was to build some nickel processing capacity in the USA. And so, thematically, it's all working in our favor. And by the way, we need it to all work in our favor.
Yes.
Getting something new started is really hard.
Yeah, certainly. You touched on so many good things there, but I want to just point out for viewers the idea of like the maritime aspects of this and how you extract the nodules. Of course, it's not some big dredging device that's sucking up the ocean floor, is it? It's far more accurate than that. It's sort of a scooping. You already talked about the dust distribution. It's fairly low intensity given the field that you'll be sort of working on and the kind of equipment that you're bringing in.
Yeah, and hopefully you can show your viewers a picture of what it looks like when we with these rocks, because literally what you look at is a pair of car tracks. So we're able to collect these nodules. Our collector fires a jet of water at them horizontally. It's known as the Kawanda engineering principle. And as the collector head moves away, it lifts the nodules. And so, we've engineered this to have the lightest touch possible. And then we separate any sediment in the machine, and then we put the nodules into a riser pipe. Think of it as a big straw that goes up to the boat. And but it's quite phenomenal. And once we pass over an area, it's passed over. These things will regrow, but this one in my hand is probably 3-4 million years old. So
wow.
I didn't be waiting around for the next batch of them. But is
that the average size? Sorry to interrupt. Is that the average size of them? Do you get much variety and
Not a lot of variety. I mean, they typically, that's average, yes. And they come bigger and smaller. Think of them as a potato size, big, medium, small. But
they're much more dense in terms of the grade here than what we'll be getting on.
That's right. Well, one thing without fail that everyone says to me when they hold one of these is how light it is. It has a specific gravity of about 1.9. And that's because of how they form. They precipitate the metals that are in the seawater or the sediment upon which they sit. And in here, we have around 1.4% nickel, 1.1% copper, 0.2% cobalt, and about 30% manganese. But the important thing is that we get to process and use 100% of these materials. So we generate no waste and no tailings. And that's a game changer for the metals industry. We're able to use 100% of the bulk of this material. And so mainly because there are no deleterious elements. There's no arsenic or mercury. And that's obviously one of the things tailings dams are and will continue to be a massive problem for society.
Very much so. Well, excellent stuff. You've spoken a bit about the exploitation code that a lot hinges on, and that's coming. But are there any other key milestones that investors or interested viewers need to look out for that could be catalysts for you to move along the journey? And then also the capitalization piece. Are you well capitalized in order to carry through those steps at the moment? Obviously, every junior company is raising, but have you got enough in cash at the moment in order to execute on this next phase?
So we reported we had $46 million at the end of June. We raised another $30 million from our current shareholders. I wasn't excited about that because clearly we would have liked to raise it at higher prices, but the fact that it all, well, 3/4 of it went to existing holders, very sticky holders, softened the blow. But as far as future financing goes, I mentioned in our last earnings call that we are focused on the many options we have for capital for this project. And the one that's at the top of my list is a traditional earn-in arrangement. So we are negotiating with parties, and this is such a high quality area. Our Nori D block, for example, it has around 350 million tons of these same nodules on it. It's where the plan is we'll be in production by the end of 2024. It has a net present value of about $15 billion if we use today's commodity prices. And, it's a prime target for someone to farm into if you're a mid-tier or oil and gas or a mining company. It's a perfect asset to do that. And I'm hopeful that we'll solve all of our future capital needs by those types of arrangements. And plus we have, other options available to us through royalty streams or offtakes and so on. And so I think you mentioned about catalysts. Well, we have our boat on the water now. We've had our collector in the water since February doing trials, but it's actually on the license area now. We'll be, the purpose of that is to conduct a pilot harvesting trial. That's important for our permitting process. We observe the area before we start, while we're harvesting, and then after we've harvested. So we have 2 boats on the water right now. And so, those results will be important. They're not sink or swim results. I think we as a company have just had an amazing track record of no mishaps. Everything has always gone to plan when it comes to our offshore campaigns. And fingers crossed this one will as well. But we should expect that there'll be bumps in the road, and they are just that. They are bumps in the road. And the big one will, of course, be when that final regulatory code drops in. And we have a team of people working on that. You can go to the ISA website and see the published timeline. You can see the fact that the 4th edition of this code was published in March 2019. It's in a pretty good state the way it is now. There's a big work plan to get it finalized, in time for us to lodge an application. And so, we see that as being low risk. And so it's an exciting time. And of course, we've already completed a lot of the onshore pilot processing work. But you can expect to hear news about more partnerships there, more people getting into the industry, and more quality names. I think that's what we'll start seeing a lot more of, quality names coming to join us on this journey.
Yeah, certainly. As the world sort of wakens up to this big need, and as you said, for some of the reasons earlier, geopolitical, but then also closer to home, that the wind's in your sails with this one. Fantastic. Well, Gerard, thanks so much for giving us an insight of the projects and the uniqueness of this and the need. And we look forward to catching up again on Assay TV to hear how the project's progressing.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you.